are stories that people prefer to forget, but some simply remain etched in time like an open wound. In 2008, in the heart of New York, a promising painter disappeared without a trace. His last work, a disturbing and haunting painting, left a trail of death and madness that to this day remains an unsolved mystery. George Bragolin was an artist whose talent was described as a gift or a curse, depending on who you asked. Born in the bustling heart of New York City in 1977, he grew up in a home where creativity was an obligation, not an option. His mother, also a painter, instilled in him from a young age the idea that art was not simply an aesthetic activity, but a tool to express what words could not convey. His father, a talented and meticulous architect, provided the perfect contrast, teaching George to follow clear processes and to keep his feet on the ground. From an early age, George showed a unique gift. He was not simply talented, but there was something about his creative style that caught the attention of those who saw his work. His first exhibitions, at the age of 10, were already the subject of praise. Local art critics spoke of his ability to capture raw emotions, describing them as disturbing to an unaccustomed viewer. Young George absorbed these comments as part of the process, perfecting a style that would later become his trademark. Intense colors, chaotic shapes, and a strange magnetism in each brushstroke. But as he grew older, something began to change. George didn't just want to capture emotions, he wanted to bring them to life. In his 20s, he began creating works that seemed alive, not literally, but in a way that observers described as unsettling. "It's as if the painting is talking to you," a critic once said in a review of his exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. In 2003, George was at the height of his career. At 26, he had already won national and international awards, and his name was heard in the most prestigious galleries in New York. He had managed to rent a studio in Hudson Yards, a space that represented not only luxury, but also an affirmation that he had achieved status as an artist. It was an old building with high ceilings, large windows, and wooden floors that creaked with every step. For George, it was perfect. But from the first day in the studio, something didn't feel right. There was a silence that was too thick, an emptiness that seemed to absorb even the sound of traffic from the nearby streets. George didn't think much of it, assuming it was the price of working in such an acoustically isolated space. As the weeks passed, the silence began to change. At first, it was just a feeling, the feeling that he was being watched. Every time George worked on his paintings, he felt a weight on his back, as if invisible eyes were staring at him from the darkest corner of the room. He turned around often, hoping to find something, but he always found nothing. He tried to distract himself by playing music or inviting friends over to the studio, but the sensation persisted and grew stronger when he was alone. One April night, while working late, he heard the noise for the first time. It was a subtle sound, a sound that could barely be described, a whisper mixed with deep, heavy breathing. George paused his brush in midair and held his breath, listening for more. He thought he was imagining it, but the sound persisted. It came from the darkest corner of the studio, where the shadows seemed thicker than usual. George turned on all the lights, trying to dispel the shadows, and convinced himself that he was tired. But that night, as he slept in his apartment, he had the first of a series of dreams that would haunt him for weeks. In the dream, he was in the studio, but he was not alone. A dark presence surrounded him, something he could not see clearly, but felt in every fiber of his body. It was oppressive, dense, as if the air were made of something solid. When he woke up, he was bathed in sweat, but he could remember no other details. Despite his fear, George continued to work. Like many artists, he was used to dealing with intense emotions and channeling them into his art. But something began to change in his work. The landscapes he painted, full of abstract shapes and bright colors, began to morph into something darker. Without realizing it, his palette shifted to dark tones, blacks, grays, deep reds. The shapes in his paintings were no longer abstract, but twisted figures that seemed to emerge from the darkness. His friends noticed the change. Frank Reyes, a photographer with whom George had worked many times, visited the studio one afternoon to see his new work. When he entered, he was transfixed. George's paintings seemed alive, as if the figures were trapped in the canvas, struggling to get out. "What's that, George?" he asked, pointing to a painting where a faceless figure seemed to be reaching out toward the viewer. George shrugged and replied in a monotone, "That's what comes out of me." Frank tried to convince him to take a break, to get out of the studio and clear his head, but George refused. He felt like he was at the pinnacle of his career, as if every brushstroke was bringing him closer to something monumental. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. A week before he disappeared, George stopped answering phone calls. When Frank went to visit him, he found him pale, with dark circles under his eyes and trembling hands. He insisted on taking him to the doctor, but George threw him out of the studio, saying he couldn't stop. It was then that Fred saw the painting that had been haunting him. It was covered with a black cloth, but the outline of the painting was visible, something large with shapes that were impossible to identify. That night, George called his best friend Mike mid-morning. Through sobs, he confessed that the painting was alive. Mike tried to calm him down, thinking he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The next day, he went to the studio but found the door locked. Inside, George worked on the painting, becoming more and more obsessed, more and more lost in his own mind. On May 27, 2008, George disappeared without a trace. His last work, still covered with the black cloth, was left abandoned in the studio, along with a note that said, "Don't touch it, it's inside." After George's disappearance, his studio fell silent. The door that the artist had kept ajar while he worked was now locked. At first, his friends and family tried to get answers from the authorities, but the investigation was fruitless. There were no witnesses, no clues, and no signs of a struggle at the scene. To the police, George's case was just another in the list of missing persons in New York City. But for those who knew him, something darker surrounded his disappearance. George's studio remained closed for weeks until his landlord, Mrs. Beth Newman, decided to move in. She couldn't afford to keep losing money by keeping the space empty, and she also felt something strange was going on. Neighbors in the building began to complain about noises coming from the studio at night. Loud bangs, as if something heavy was falling, and the sound of footsteps dragging across the floor. Some even claimed to have heard a faint murmur, although they could never identify the words. Mrs. Beth entered the studio on July 14th, accompanied by her son Victor. The place was exactly as George had left it. The strong aroma of paint still permeated the air, and the artist's tools were scattered about the space, as if he had left in a hurry. But what caught Beth's attention most was the large canvas covered with a black cloth in the center of the studio. Victor, curious, tried to lift the cloth, but his mother stopped him. "Don't touch that," she said firmly, although her face showed concern. There was something about the presence of the painting that made her deeply uncomfortable, as if the room around her had become colder. They decided to leave him there, but that same afternoon, Mrs. Beth contacted George's closest friend, Frank Reyes, to take care of his belongings. When Frank arrived at the studio a few days later, a strange feeling came over him. Although the space was lit by daylight, the atmosphere seemed heavy, almost oppressive. As a photographer, Frank had a special sensitivity to capture atmosphere, and George's studio seemed to breathe a palpable anguish. Ignoring his instincts, he began to pack up his friend's art supplies and personal belongings. It was then that his gaze fell on the painting covered by the black cloth. He remembered what George had said weeks before he disappeared. "It's what's inside me." Frank didn't want to look at it, but something drew him to it, as if the canvas was silently calling him from its corner. After hesitating for a few minutes, he walked over and lifted the black cloth. The painting took his breath away. It was an abstract work, but with such vivid detail that it seemed to move in the light. The shapes were chaotic, twisted, as if something were trapped inside the canvas and struggling to get out. The center of the painting was dominated by a dark figure with intense red eyes that seemed to follow Frank as he moved around the room. Even though he knew it was impossible, he felt as if the gaze was piercing him, as if it were judging him. That night, as he slept, Fred had a terrible dream. He was in George's studio, surrounded by darkness, and the painting was watching him from the center of the room. But now, it was not just a painting. The dark figure inside the canvas was moving, reaching out toward him. Frank tried to scream, but his voice would not come out. When he woke up, he was drenched in sweat and feeling suffocated. He decided that the painting had to leave the studio. He considered destroying it, but was afraid that George would return and blame him for the destruction of his masterpiece. Instead, he contacted an acquaintance of his, Richard, a contemporary art collector with a penchant for disturbing pieces. Without mentioning the strange occurrences, Fred offered the painting to Richard, who agreed to buy it without hesitation. The painting was moved to Richard's home, a Manhattan mansion filled with extravagant and unique pieces. Gerardo was enchanted by the work, calling it a masterpiece of the surreal. But just 2 weeks after acquiring the painting, Richard was found dead in his studio. The scene was disconcerting. Richard's body lay on the floor with a look of absolute terror on his face. George's painting was still hanging on the wall, but something had changed. The center of the painting now looked darker, as if the shadows had grown and spread to the edges. There were also red stains that hadn't been there when Frank had delivered it. It looked like blood, although its origin was never confirmed. The police investigated the case, but found no signs of violence or traces of anyone else in the house. The official cause of death was a heart attack, although the coroner privately mentioned that the stress levels reflected in the body were abnormally high. When Frank found out what happened, a shiver ran through his body. He decided not to say anything about the strange happenings surrounding the painting, but he couldn't help but feel responsible. Meanwhile, the painting was removed from the site by Richard's family, who didn't know what to do with it. A distant cousin, Roberto, decided to keep him in a private warehouse, away from prying eyes. At the warehouse, things soon turned disturbing. The man in charge of the place, Jonathan, a robust and skeptical man, began reporting strange incidents. First, there were noises, loud knocks that seemed to come from the basement where the painting was stored, especially at night. Jonathan thought it was some animal that had sneaked in, but every time he checked, he found nothing. Over time, the noises became clearer and more persistent, as if something heavy was continually falling and rising. The blows were so strong that the basement walls vibrated. Jonathan decided not to pay much attention, thinking it could be structural problems. However, the noises weren't the only thing that started to bother him. One night, while making his usual rounds with a flashlight in his hand, Jonathan saw something that stopped him cold. He passed the warehouse where the painting was stored, and out of the corner of his eye he thought he saw movement. He quickly turned the flashlight on the door, but there was no one there. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but in the metallic reflection of the lock, he thought he saw red eyes glowing faintly. That same night, Jonathan had a disturbing dream. In the dream, he was inside the warehouse, completely dark. He could hear his own breathing echoing in the empty space, when suddenly he felt something watching him. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there, close by, waiting. Jonathan tried to run towards the exit, but the door was closed. Then he felt a huge weight on his chest, as if something invisible was crushing him. When he woke up, he was panting and his heart was beating frantically. He decided not to go near the warehouse again at night. Meanwhile, Frank, who was trying to distance himself from the painting and everything related to George, couldn't get the painting out of his head. The strange events that followed George's disappearance followed him like a shadow. One afternoon, armed with courage, he decided to go back to George's diaries that he kept in his house. The pages were full of scribbles, incomplete sentences, and abstract drawings that seemed to make no sense. But as he continued, Frank began to notice a pattern. The drawings became darker, more violent, as George got closer to finishing the painting. On one of the last pages, he found a sketch that left him cold. He was the central figure in the painting, his red eyes shining brightly. Below the drawing, George had written a single sentence: "He's calling me." The words echoed in Frank's mind for days. What did it mean that something was calling him? Could it be that George had come into contact with something he didn't understand? Even more disturbing, was that what he had captured in the painting? Motivated by these questions, Frank decided to visit the warehouse where the painting was stored. It was not difficult to find the address, since Jonathan's cousin Roberto had mentioned in a previous conversation where he had decided to keep the work. Frank showed up on a cold November morning. When he arrived, fog covered the streets and the air smelled musty. When Frank arrived at the warehouse, Jonathan greeted him with obvious discomfort. When he saw him, Jonathan felt an inexplicable chill. There was something in Frank's gaze, a mixture of determination and fear, that put him on guard. When Frank explained that he wanted to see the painting, Richard flatly refused. "That thing shouldn't be here," he exclaimed, his voice shaking. "What do you mean?" Frank asked, trying to sound casual. "I haven't had a good night's sleep since it arrived. That painting, there's something wrong with it." Frank insisted, saying he needed to see her for personal reasons. Jonathan, though reluctant, finally agreed. He took him to the basement, but he didn't dare go in. "There you go. If you decide to go in, that's your problem." Frank pushed the door open slowly and turned on the flashlight on his phone. The painting was in the center of the warehouse, still covered by the top. The air inside was thick, as if it were lacking oxygen, and the silence was so absolute that he could hear his own heartbeat. He advanced cautiously, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. When he stood before the painting, he took a deep breath and lifted the canvas. There it was, exactly as he remembered it, but something had changed. The red spots he had seen before now seemed more pronounced, as if they had expanded, and the central figure's eyes shone with an unnatural intensity. Suddenly, he felt a shiver run down his spine, and the flashlight on his phone began to flicker. In the darkness, he thought he saw a shadow moving behind him. He turned quickly, but there was nothing. That was when he heard a whisper, so low that he could barely make it out, but enough to freeze him in place. "Help me," the voice said, faint and barely audible, but there was no doubt that it was coming from the painting. Frank backed away, tripping over some boxes stacked behind him. The flashlight fell to the floor, leaving the room in darkness. Filled with terror, he ran out of the warehouse, leaving the canvas on one side of the picture. Jonathan watched him leave, pale and trembling, and didn't need to ask what had happened. "I told you," Jonathan murmured, his voice thick with resignation. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The words he had heard in the warehouse kept repeating in his head, "Help me." But what worried him most was the feeling that something was still watching him, even after he had left that place. He knew the painting needed to be destroyed, but he also knew it wouldn't be that simple. The work seemed alive, a presence that could not disappear so easily. And worst of all, Frank had the unsettling suspicion that the voice he heard was not George's, but something else, something he himself had awakened. Over the next few days, Frank tried to seek help. He contacted art experts, curators, and even gallery owners, but they all seemed reluctant to get involved. Some had already heard rumors about the work and were afraid to touch it. Paranoia began to take over Frank. Sometimes, walking through the streets of New York, he felt a presence behind him. When he turned to look, he saw nothing, but in his mind, the red-eyed figure remained fixed, unchanging. A part of him wanted to leave it all behind, forget about this nightmare and move on with his life. However, he couldn't. I knew there was something more behind all of this, something I didn't fully understand yet. He had decided to go back to the warehouse. I couldn't continue living with this uncertainty. When he arrived, Jonathan was watching him from afar, visibly disturbed. Frank wasted no time and headed straight for the warehouse. "Did you see?" Frank asked without preamble. "Yes," Jonathan replied, his tone serious. "It's impossible not to see." Frank approached the painting, now covered by a torn canvas. He slowly removed the cloth, and as he did so, the atmosphere in the basement seemed to change. It was as if the painting exuded something, a palpable energy that enveloped him. The figure's eyes glowed with the same intensity as before, but this time, something was different. There was a movement within them, as if they were alive, looking at him. Suddenly, Frank's flashlight, which he had placed on a table, went out. Darkness filled the room, and the air became heavy, difficult to breathe. Jonathan took a step back, visibly nervous. "Don't come any closer, Frank. That thing isn't what it seems," Jonathan said, his voice shaking. But Frank couldn't resist. The painting seemed to beckon him, an almost tangible presence that drew him toward it. He took one step after another, as if hypnotized, until he was standing in front of the painting. His breathing quickened. He could feel goosebumps on his skin and a tightness in his chest that made it hard to bear. As he reached for the canvas, something inexplicable happened. An invisible force pushed him backward, throwing him to the ground with such force that he nearly lost consciousness. The sound of his body falling was thunderous, but something else was also heard, a low whisper that seemed to come directly from the painting. At first, Frank thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, but then he heard it clearly. "Help me." This time, the voice was louder, more desperate. Frank tried to get up, but something kept him glued to the ground, as if he were trapped in an invisible spider's web. As he struggled to free himself, he felt his mind begin to cloud. The basement walls seemed to close in around him, and the shadows moved with a life of their own, dancing in a macabre swing. Jonathan, who was observing the scene from afar, shouted something, but his words were drowned out by the growing murmur that seemed to emanate from the painting. Frank tried to cover his ears, but he couldn't block out the whispers. They weren't in the air. They were inside his mind, in his soul, as if every fiber of his being was being invaded. At that moment, something changed in the image. The central figure began to transform. What had once seemed human became distorted, stretching and deforming until it became something grotesque, a shadow with unrecognizable features. The red eyes, which never stopped staring at him, shone with a blinding intensity. It was then that Frank understood. What he saw was not a creature or a demon. It was something older, something waiting for the right moment to manifest itself. The figure seemed to extend beyond the canvas, as if the painting could no longer contain it. The shadows dancing in the room took shape, resembling human figures that moved slowly toward Frank and Jonathan. Terror filled them both, but the painting seemed to center on Frank, as if claiming him for its own. "Get out of here! Run!" Jonathan shouted, his voice full of panic. But Frank couldn't move. He was trapped by an invisible force that kept him fixed in front of the painting. In a desperate attempt to free himself, Jonathan tried to get closer to Frank to help him, but an invisible pressure threw him against the wall, leaving him immobilized. The painting, however, began to glow with an intense red light. The shadows in the room lengthened even further, enveloping Frank as if they were devouring him. And then something terrible happened. The figure on the screen spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, as if it came from an unfathomable abyss. "It's too late to save him," said the figure. The words hung in the air like an endless echo, and the painting emitted a final, blinding flash that filled the warehouse with a red light so intense it seemed to consume everything around it. Frank, completely trapped by the paint, could no longer resist. His body was slowly absorbed by the painting, as if the work were taking his life. Jonathan, still paralyzed by the invisible force, watched Frank disappear completely. The painting, now darker and more grotesque than ever, seemed to have taken something from him. The red eyes that had once glowed were now dull, but the oppression in the air did not disappear. The warehouse remained in absolute silence, broken only by Jonathan's labored breathing. When he finally managed to move, Jonathan fled the scene in terror. But in his mind, the words from the painting kept echoing, "It's too late to save him." After escaping from the warehouse, Jonathan was unable to find peace. Even though he had left the painting behind, he felt something following him, as if the painting's cursed presence had attached itself to him. In his mind, the images from the painting continued to repeat themselves, and Frank's face being consumed by the painting tormented him incessantly. He tried to return to his daily routine, but the events at the warehouse did not leave him alone. Every night I heard strange noises, like shuffling footsteps and unintelligible murmurs. Jonathan became convinced that there must be something deeper connected to the painting, something that Frank and George had awakened. Meanwhile, the painting remained in the warehouse, once again covered with a tarp. But the place was not peaceful. Other warehouse workers began reporting strange phenomena, lights flickering for no reason, tools appearing in different places than where they had left them, and sometimes an overwhelming feeling of being watched. No one wanted to work near the warehouse where the painting was stored. Jonathan, terrified but determined to find answers, decided to investigate further into George's past and his mysterious work. He visited art galleries where he had exhibited his work, spoke to critics who had admired his work, and scoured newspaper archives for clues. Little by little, he began to piece together the story of George's obsession with painting. In one of his searches, he found an article about an interview that George had given months before his disappearance. In it, he spoke vaguely about a presence he felt while working in his studio. "I'm not alone when I paint," he said in the interview. "There's something here with me, something that wants to come out." Jonathan, intrigued and terrified by what he discovered, decided to visit Mike, George's best friend, who was the last person to speak to him before his disappearance. Mike was initially reluctant to speak, but Jonathan convinced him that any information could help him understand what had happened to George. Mike confessed that on their last call, George was on the verge of breaking down. "He told me the painting was alive, that there was something inside it," Mike recalled with a lump in his throat. "I tried to calm him down, but that night was the last time I spoke to him." Jonathan asked if he knew anything else, any detail that could explain what George was experiencing. Mike mentioned that days before he started working on his latest job, George found an old book in a used bookstore. It was a dark text, full of symbols and incomprehensible writing, and George was convinced it contained secrets about how to take his works to the next artistic level. Jonathan realized that this book could have been the key to everything. He decided to take a look at George's studio to see if the book was still there. He contacted the landlady, Beth, and asked her for access to the place. Although hesitant, Beth accepted, warning him that no one had come in since George's disappearance. Upon entering, Jonathan felt an immediate oppression, as if the air were heavier. He walked around the room cautiously, rummaging through the art supplies and corners of the studio. Finally, in a drawer of George's desk, he found the book. It was a leather-bound volume with a strange symbol engraved on the cover. When he opened it, Jonathan felt a shiver. The pages were filled with diagrams and text in a language I couldn't identify, but there were notes written by George in the margins. Among the notes, Jonathan read phrases that filled him with terror. "I feel him closer. He is here with me, and if I finish this, he can be released." It seemed like George was fighting something he inadvertently summoned using the book's instructions. Jonathan took the book and left the office, determined to learn more about what George had revealed. He consulted occult experts, but most refused to help upon seeing the book. One researcher agreed to analyze it and explained that the symbols were part of an ancient ritual designed to capture supernatural entities in objects. George unknowingly followed the instructions and caught something in his painting. Jonathan's understanding of what had happened took on a new dimension. He now knew that the painting was not only cursed, but contained an entity that was trying to break free. Jonathan understood that it would not be enough to destroy the painting. He had to find a way to neutralize it and seal away what was inside it forever. He returned to the warehouse to confront. He returned to the warehouse to face the painting one last time. This time, Jonathan was prepared. He brought with him the book and the tools he needed to attempt a counter-ritual that could seal the entity away. When he arrived, the place was completely silent, a silence that weighed like a stone. Jonathan felt that each step he took brought him closer to the edge of something he did not fully understand. He opened the cellar door and turned on a flashlight. There lay the painting, covered with canvas. He removed the cloth with shaking hands, and a wave of cold air enveloped him. The figure in the painting seemed even darker and more grotesque, and the red eyes glowed with an unearthly intensity. Jonathan knew he could not hesitate. He opened the book and began to read the counter-ritual instructions, reciting the words George had written in the margins. As he did so, the atmosphere in the warehouse changed dramatically. The shadows on the walls began to move as if they were alive, and a deep murmur filled the room. The lights flickered, and Jonathan felt as if the air was being sucked into the painting, but he didn't stop. He continued reciting the words, although his voice was shaking. The paint reacted. The shapes within the canvas seemed to move violently, as if the entity was struggling to break free. The red eyes began to expand, illuminating the room with an almost blinding glow. A deep, husky voice sounded from the painting. "You cannot stop me. This world will be mine." Jonathan continued reading in terror, raising his voice to drown out the presence trying to overwhelm him. As he continued, the painting began to crack, as if something inside it was being forced to remain locked away. The shadows intensified, and Jonathan felt a huge pressure in his chest, but he did not stop. With a final cry, he recited the final words of the counter-ritual. The frame emitted a final flash of red light, then faded. The shadows disappeared, and the place fell completely silent. The painting was unrecognizable. The surface was now gray and opaque, with no trace of the red eyes or the twisted figures. Jonathan fell to the ground, exhausted and shaking, but certain that he had successfully sealed the entity. He decided to burn the painting and book to ensure they could never be used again. That same night, he took the two objects to a remote location outside the city, where he lit a large fire. The painting, wrapped in the canvas that covered it, was placed on top of the flames, followed by the book. As the fire grew, Jonathan felt a mixture of relief and fear. It took a while for the painting to burn completely, as if the matter itself resisted being destroyed. The flames made strange crackling noises, and at times Jonathan thought he heard whispers coming from the fire. But he didn't stop. He remained there until only ashes remained. With the painting and book destroyed, Jonathan came back to life, although he was never the same again. The events he witnessed left deep marks on him. For days, he had disturbing dreams in which he felt something watching him in the darkness, but over time, these dreams began to disappear. In turn, the warehouse where the painting was stored also regained some normality. Employees no longer reported strange phenomena, and Jonathan was finally able to put that dark chapter of his life behind him. However, one doubt remained in his mind. What if he hadn't completely destroyed the entity? What if he had somehow managed to survive somewhere else? Jonathan tried not to think about it, but he knew the answer would never be completely clear. Despite everything, he decided to keep what had happened a secret, fearing that any mention of the painting would draw attention to what it contained. It was a burden he would have to bear alone, but he was willing to do it to protect others. Eventually, Jonathan moved away from the city, looking to start over in a place where the shadows of the past couldn't reach him.